I'm Connor Ruebusch, and if you are interested in the finer points of face punching, you've come to the right place. This is Heavy Hands. Hello, I don't know why I took such a big breath before starting to record there. I really sucked it in. My brain's not working right. I pulled an all-nighter, Pat.
Why did you pull an all-nighter, Connor?
Finishing MMA for boxing, fist fighting for the freestyle fighter, part 1.
Oh, and, just get that plug right in there in the first first opening segment of the show here. I like where your head's at.
That's right. That is right. I got the whole title in there. And I stayed up all night finishing that. So I'm going to sound like I'm sort of vaguely intoxicated throughout long portions of this episode. You may hear little pitter-patters of drool hitting the microphone if I doze off at some point. It's not you, Pat. It's me. But welcome, everyone, to Heavy Hands. We've got a bit of a mixed bag episode for you guys today, but we are looking forward to it. We've got a lot of different topics to get to. Starting off, we're going to get into our Styles Make Fight series. Those of you who don't know that, I encourage you to go and check out all of those episodes. We spent the first 5 episodes of our Styles Make Fight series sort of breaking down what we see as the 5 major styles in combat sports, and we draw these from boxing, and we're still working on expanding them fully to fit MMA, but we have boxer punchers, outfighters / boxers, pressure fighters, counter punchers, and brawlers. And we have now continued the Styles Make Fight series, having covered all of those styles in depth and conjectured about them and all of that. We're now extending it to be able to make stylistic predictions. That's kind of our idea. So a few months ago, I think back in October, maybe November, we made some picks for 7 upcoming fights that I think all took place in the end of 2016. And we made picks for these, and they were all fights in which we agreed the style matchups differed, or the styles of the two fighters were not the same. And the goal of this is basically, over a period of time, to get some data together and to see if we can actually come up with a predictive model for predicting fights based on the styles of the fighters taking part in them. Is that a good enough description, Pat? Am I losing my mind here?
Yeah, no, it sounds about right. It's more like, this is not, I would say, a kind of an in-depth, detailed, like, research project. It's more like this is a thing that we come back to from time to time. We're trying to collect some data and trying to see how these archetypes work out in real life. Right.
So, and I would like to, as we discuss this as well, maybe we can get into a little bit with some of these fighters, our current theories, at least as they stand right now, on how wrestling and grappling fit into these archetypes. Because obviously, outfighter, boxer, puncher, counterfighter, pressure fighter, and brawler are boxing things. 2 of those types do or can include the word boxer. So they come from boxing, and they are obviously designed around the idea of striking exchanges and striking battles, and specifically punching battles. And so while I think that because styles are determined by personality first and foremost, that the styles must cross over in some way, I don't yet really have a firm grasp on what the grappling version of each of these styles might look like. Or if there is indeed...
I don't think that they can apply to grappling on the ground. I think they can apply to wrestling. I think they can apply to judo. I think they can apply to things where there is movement in space. But
that makes
like
sense.
in terms of your approach on the ground, I don't think there's necessarily a correlation. You know, like
I wonder if there might be. Go on, sorry.
They're not the same thing, because they like, maybe there's some sort of deep personality thing that expresses itself that way. I don't think so. And frankly, because like at some point you're not comparing apples and oranges anymore. Mm-hmm. You're comparing apples and, I don't know, fucking coconuts or something.
I was going to say walnuts, but fucking coconuts is pretty good.
Or potatoes. Like this, it's
hey, pomme de terre,
things
ground
that
apples.
are so categorically different on the, like, actually on the mat, where your directionality of your movement and the style of your movement, like really, if we think about what defines our stylistic archetypes, it's preferred direction of movement. It's where in the cage do you want to be. Those are not things that can apply to jiu-jitsu style grappling. They're just not, because you're not moving in open space at all, period. It's not, you're not doing that. You're connected to another person. Like, and so if somebody wants to come up with grappling archetypes, that's fine. And maybe they could see the correlation. I'm not interested in trying to figure that out.
I've seen a few good ones pitched, actually, a few good ideas for what the archetypes might be. Now, I'm going to disagree with you slightly. We don't have to get into it in depth. But I do have I'm going to keep my eye out as we do this, and we don't have to talk about it every time we retouch on this series on the show. But I do have a feeling that, for me, it's not just, directionality of movement that determines the styles, right? It's risk averseness. It's aggression. It's things like that as well. And I think those may have some parallel, but I'm not sure. And I don't know, and I'm not willing to say concretely.
Well, yeah, but they don't. But those underlying personality characteristics in terms of risk aversion or aggression, they express themselves in directionality of movement. Right. And that is something that we can see and measure very straightforwardly.
True. They're not going to be defined by like it's not going to determine what's your favorite position on the ground or something like that.
Yeah, or what are you, or necessarily what are you trying to get to? Like that's not. I mean, because all pressure fighters are not out there hunting for guillotines in transition. Like all all outfighters are not people who love to play guard. Like that's not. There's just not a correlation.
I would say most of the outfighters I know are top control artists. Like stiflers.
Because everybody should be a top control.
Well, I mean stiflers though, in the GSP mode, sort of control oriented more than aggressive. But again, it's not worth discussing now because we don't know. And I'm just going to keep it in the back of my mind, and I'm never going to mention it to you again, Pat. Let's quickly run back on the matchups that we picked for our last round to retouch on them. I think I remember which people I picked in each of these. In fact, I'm pretty certain I do. And then we'll basically run up the tally as it stands, which is basically just no more than 1-0 for any of the various style matchups. We did Frankie Edgar versus Jeremy Stevens. I believe we both picked Frankie Edgar in that fight. We called it Outfighter versus Boxer Puncher. The Outfighter did indeed beat the Boxer Puncher. We did Benil Dariush versus Rashid Magomedov. I think we both picked Magomedov in that fight, calling him the counterfighter against the Boxer Puncher, and the Boxer Puncher won. Do you feel that Dariush is perhaps better called a pressure fighter?
I think he is now, but that was not necessarily the case before these last two fights.
That's the thing too, man. This data is going to be, it's good to have as much as you can because it's always going to be a little wishy-washy to make these determinations, and they're always going to be a little fluid. We had Sam Alvey versus Alex Nicholson, counterfighter versus brawler. We both went with the counterfighter in Alvey. He did win, although not necessarily by counterfighting. We had Rafael Natal versus Tim Boach, boxer puncher versus brawler. I picked Natal. Did you pick Boach?
No, I think I picked Natal.
We fucked up. The brawler beat the boxer puncher in Natal. We had Lidas versus Yatko. We weren't really sure what to call Lidas. You feel that he's a boxer puncher. I kind of suspect he's a brawler pretending to be a boxer puncher. Either way, the outfighter in Krzysztof Yatko soundly beat him. We had Thomas Almeida versus Albert Morales. I think at the time we could call that pressure fighter versus brawler, and the pressure fighter won. And then we had Yoel Romero versus Chris Weidman, boxer puncher versus pressure fighter, and the boxer puncher won. So as it stands right now, we have 4 fights each for boxer punchers and brawlers, and only 2 fights each for the pressure fighters and outfighters. So really not enough data to really say anything. But we've got, let's see, 9 fights to pick for the coming months that we will revisit on after they have all been completed, and we're going to get into those now, not necessarily into exhaustive detail, especially with the bigger ones, which we will be covering when those fights approach. We can maybe get into a little more detail with the smaller ones that we won't have time to discuss when the cards are near. But let's start off with Will Brooks versus Charles Oliveira. I am calling that an outfighter versus... Would you call Charles Oliveira, Pat, a brawler or a pressure fighter?
I would say that he is somewhere between a pressure fighter and a brawler. I think he does his best work pressuring, but I think when the chips are down, he throws, which is kind of weird because I think he throws from a place of fragility rather than a place of strength. Yep. Like, I think it's one of those things that comes about when you start fighting real young. and you're in a gym where everybody goes real hard in sparring all the time, which I think is the case for Charles Oliveira. That when you start doing that when you're 16, 17, 18, it kind of instills in you very deeply. Like Stefan Struve is the same way. This desire to just bang it out, to show that you can't be bullied. And I mean, but I think really if you're thinking about his wheelhouse rather than just like his psychological blind spot, it's probably pressure. I think that's when he does his best work. He pressured Anthony Pettis. Basically, every great performance of Oliveira's career, really spotty career, has been one where he pressured.
Yeah, and of course, styles may be determined by personalities, but personalities do change over time. And good trainers often try to instill some kind of positive change in their fighters' mentalities. So you could perhaps call Charles Oliveira a brawler by nature, but a pressure fighter by design. And I would say at this point it's probably fair to call him a pressure fighter. Like I wouldn't call Marcos Maidana a brawler anymore. You know what I mean? Even though he's never going to fight again. In his fights with Floyd, at that point, I wouldn't call him a brawler. I would have called him a boxer puncher or a pressure fighter. The fighters do in fact change. So I think pressure fighter is the way to go. Will Brooks, of course, the very defined outfighter, arguably the most defined outfighter in the UFC. And certainly the most defined 5-round fighter. What's your pick in that fight?
Between Brooks and Oliveira, I mean, I'm taking Brooks, hands down. But if we're talking purely about that stylistic matchup, I think it will involve Brooks meeting pressure with pressure, more or less, and agreeing to kind of bang with Oliveira. Like I don't think he's going to try to stay away. I think he's the more physical fighter. So if this isn't all the way out or all the way in thing, I think Brooks is going to want to be all the way in and fighting Oliveira in the clinch.
You would. The boxing axiom would have it that the pressure fighter beats the outfighter. But maybe we can't. We're not just picking based on stylistic. We're making picks and then we're seeing what the styles say. We're reading the bones. So I will say Will Brooks as well. I'm taking the outfighter over the pressure fighter. And but I mean, would you be really shocked if Oliveira gave Brooks some serious trouble by just constantly swarming him and just throwing heat and wrapping him up and
I would be surprised because I think Brooks is just a way better fighter than Oliveira.
Yeah.
I still have a lot of faith in Will Brooks. Like I don't hold that performance against Alex Oliveira against him. I think that he was fighting a dude who outweighed him by probably 25 pounds.
Yeah.
He broke his rib. He still gave a pretty good accounting of himself as much as he could under those circumstances. Like I do not really hold that against him. I have a lot of faith in him, especially on the inside. And I think Oliveira to win this fight is going to have to get Brooks down. And when he gets Brooks and if he consents to fight Brooks in the clinch, which is where Oliveira gets most of his takedowns, then I think Oliveira is going to get absolutely chewed up by a guy who's bigger and stronger and more athletic and frankly meaner in those kinds of exchanges.
Maybe it'll be a little similar to Brooks's fight with Pearson. Standing his ground a little bit, trying to prove a point.
Yeah, actually, that seems like the most likely outcome to me. And two, this is a fight where, leaving aside the stylistic aspect of it, like Brooks has a way deeper gas tank. Barring a broken rib, like Chucky Olives is probably going to gas, and when he does, Brooks is going to take him down, get on top of him, and just wail on him mercilessly until Oliveira quits, which he will.
Why is this the first time I've heard Chucky Olives?
I got that from MMA gambler Lance Fishel, as he and I were talking about this fight.
That's a good one. Okay, so we're both taking Brooks, the outfighter, over the pressure fighter in Charles Oliveira, a.k.a. Chucky Olives, a.k.a. the Hands of God. I could go on all day with Ghostface Killah-inspired nicknames, but let's move on to our next matchup. We've got heavyweights, Alexander Volkov versus Roy Nelson. I'm inclined to call this outfighter versus brawler. What's your take on the matchup?
Yeah, that sounds about right. And, but what's your read on how this plays out?
There was a time when Roy Nelson, and who knows, because Roy Nelson has had his renaissances where he has come back and looked like he's reinvigorated himself. There was a time when I think Nelson would have had a very good chance of catching Volkov, who's kind of hittable, very tall, and doesn't, he's more, let's say he's more Antonio Margarito than he is Diego Corrales when it comes to like his ability to defend himself with his head hanging high up in the air. So I'm going to go ahead and say Volkov despite that, because at this point I don't feel that I can trust Roy Nelson. I think an outfighter should beat a brawler, stylistically anyway. More output, distance management, and of course he's got the build for a good outfighter as well, and Roy Nelson does not. So I think the size disparity, technical edge, and the stylistic matchup all kind of favor Volkov, as well as the fact that he is the much more youthful fighter at this point.
Yeah, so I think we have seen a little bit of a renaissance from Roy Nelson in his last like 3 or 4 fights. Like we've seen a lot from him that we didn't necessarily see before. We've seen more takedowns. Mm-hmm. We've seen a lot more of his top game. We've seen his left hand. We've seen a little bit of a jab. We've seen some low kicks. We've seen a left hook. The problem is at this point, years and years and years of, basically fighting as a fat dude and the toll and all of the damage that he's taken has really worn him down physically. Like yes. That kind of surprising speed that he used to have, that surprising closing speed, is mostly gone. And frankly, I don't think he hits as hard as he used to. I don't think he has the kind of pop that he used to have in his right hand.
It was always athletic pop, you know what I mean? I don't think he ever really had great punching mechanics. It was just that he was explosive. And so maybe that is the kind of power that does fade with age.
Yeah, I mean, his only knockout win over the last 3 years is Bigfoot Silva.
What about Big Nog, right?
That was almost 3 years ago. By the time he fights again, it will have been more than 3 years.
Really? It was that long ago?
Yeah, it was April of 2014.
Wow. Yeah. So you favor Volkov as well?
Yeah, I favor him pretty substantially. Like that wouldn't necessarily be the case if this were the Nelson of 2012 or 2013, but as it stands right now, yeah.
Even if it were maybe the Nelson who showed up against Barnett, like super stamina, high output Nelson, could maybe give Volkov some trouble. The brawler is always the unpredictable, but even then, like Josh Barnett in frame and speed doesn't really compare to Volkov. So,
yeah, you know what? Now I'm kind of rethinking this. I think if Nelson can make his
if he can pressure, I think he can.
Yeah,
win.
If he can get on the inside, if he can impose his takedown game, then this is definitely a winnable fight for him. Volkov is not like a fantastic defensive wrestler or a fantastic grappler,
nor a fantastic defensive striker.
Yeah, I mean, Volkov is not a lot of things.
Yeah. I mean, you get pieced up by Tim Johnson. I mean, I don't blame you. I love Tim Johnson more than anybody else on this planet, but not a great sign. Not a great sign for your striking defense.
Probably not.
Okay, let's move on. Tim Elliott versus Louis Smolka. I think Tim Elliott is a pressure fighter at this point in his career. That's my read on him. Louis Smolka I would call a boxer puncher. What about you?
Yeah, I would say that's about right. Mostly because he resists easy categorization, I would say. Like, he does a lot of things.
Elliott?
In a fight. Yeah, and Elliott, I guess, is...
Or were you talking about Smolka or Elliott there?
Well, I think Smolka is probably a boxer puncher.
Yeah, is that why you're saying he resists category? Is that what you were talking about?
Yeah, because he does a lot of different things, basically. I don't think that Smolka has a really defined preference. Whereas Elliott is a pressure fighter. Yeah,
Elliott maybe wasn't always, but for like the last 3 years has just been swarming and I would even call him in the subcategory of swarmer. And why is it, Pat? Is it just because we both consider ourselves pressure fighters that pressure fighting is the only category in which we have 2 subcategories? Because I don't think we have any subcategories for the other styles, but we like to talk about our aggressive counterpunchers and our swarmers as well as just regular pressure fighters.
Yeah, that's true. I think it is because we see the art to pressure.
That's right. It's a little favoritism, but that's okay.
I think pressure and aggression get unfairly stigmatized in combat sports sometimes by like the thinking person's fans. And so I think it's important. We both feel it's important to emphasize the art in pressure.
I'm that dude who gets really upset whenever the first thing somebody says about Julio Cesar Chavez is how good his chin was. I'm like, fuck you. He was an amazing defensive fighter. He was a brilliant pressure fighter. Don't talk about his chin because he didn't need it that much.
Dicks.
Dicks.
Yeah.
I'm going to go ahead and take Tim Elliott, the pressure fighter, over the boxer puncher.
Yeah.
Not sure what's going on with Louis
I'm not
Smolka these
taking him
days.
because of anything that he does on the feet. I'm taking him because I think he will out-scramble and outwork Louis Smolka on the ground.
Yeah, I mean, I think he will, at the very least, take him down quite easily. Tim Elliott's always been a shockingly good takedown artist. Taking down, I think he took down Joe Benavidez 3 times in like 3 minutes. Couldn't hold him down, but the scrambling, it's no shame in not being able to hold down Joe B. And Louis Smolka, not exactly sure what's going on with him these days. I don't think he's looked bad per se. I just think maybe he kind of got a streak of good luck with those wins, and maybe his game isn't quite as complete as we would have maybe wanted it to be. I mean, even the fights where he was on that streak, they were all pretty scrappy and back and forth. So maybe that's the curse of the boxer-puncher, man, because Smolka has a lot of technical skill. In his striking, he's got more than it seems at times, and his grappling, he sure has a lot, and in his wrestling too. But often seems to sort of fall prey to the idea of just doing his thing. You know what I mean? Just sort of flowing and playing dangerous.
It also doesn't help that he is not especially physically gifted. Like, he's big and he's long for the division.
Sort of willowy.
But he's not especially strong.
Yeah.
He has strong hips, but I think that's about it. And he's not fast at all. He's not especially explosive. Like, he's got great cardio. I think he's a try-hard dude who can do a lot of different things. And there's nothing wrong with that. But but when you like to scrambling is something that depends very heavily on athleticism, not just on technical skill. So if you can, Smolka out-scrambled Neil Seery, but he got eaten alive by Ray Borg.
Right.
And I think of those two guys, Tim Elliott is closer to Ray Borg than he is to Neil Seery in terms of scrambling skill and physicality.
Yeah, I would agree. So we are both taking the pressure fighter and Tim Elliott over the boxer puncher and Louis Smolka, though not necessarily just because of the style matchup. Next up, we got a banger. I'm actually maybe more excited about this fight than any of the others here. James Vick versus Marco Polo Reyes. James Vick, always capable of surprising. Marco Polo Reyes, consistently fucking awesome. I'm going to go ahead and say James Vick, outfighter versus Polo Reyes, boxer puncher. Sounds about right to you?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct.
Yeah, these guys are pretty easy.
I'm taking the outsider here.
You're taking the outsider. You're taking Vick.
Yep.
Interesting.
Yeah, I think it's going to be real hard for Reyes to get inside. Like, the height and reach disparity combined with the fact that Vick has slowly but surely added some real technical acumen as an outfighter, it makes it hard for me to think that Reyes is going to find ways to get his game off the ground. I'm
going to go with Polo Reyes, and I'm going to tell you why. It's not necessarily the style matchup. I think it is, though I do think having a little ferocity can help against Vick, but the reason for that is not because he's an outfighter, but because his defense isn't very good. And I think Marco Polo Reyes has pretty good defense, and I think it's getting better bit by bit. I think he's pretty prodigious as a fighter. He's still quite young in the game and has made some really great strides over there at Alliance. So I'm going to go with Polo Reyes. I think he's going to be able to pressure James Vick, basically. Pressure him and counter him. And possibly knock him out like Dariush did, because we can both agree Polo Reyes has some nasty power in his hands.
Yeah, he's a fun fighter, man. I really like his game quite a bit.
He's not been in any bad fights in the UFC.
No, and he's fairly sizable. Like, he's not giving up that much height and reach to Vick relative to some of the other guys who have fought him. He's giving up 4 inches, I think, in both. But that's still a lot. That's still a lot of distance to have to cover. I don't like James Vick as a fighter. I hate the eye pokes. I kind of dislike in general his approach to the game and his strike selection, but he is pretty good at it.
Yeah,
I don't like his
James
game, but
Vick.
I appreciate it.
I do like James Vick as a fighter. I'm sure you're not surprised to hear that, because I like my just junk pile fighters who are just made of odd parts. And I like him in spite of the fact that he is stuck with Lloyd Irvin.
He is a human island of misfit toys in terms of his game.
Yes, he is. And I like him despite the fact that he's stuck with Lloyd Irvin. So
I can never get behind that.
Yeah, well, I don't. I'll consider him like a poor, ignorant fool who's been conned, and that allows me to still root for him.
I have no sympathy for the marks of the world.
Let's go on to light heavyweight matchup. Volkan Oezdemir, surprising win in his debut over a very flat Ovince St. Preux versus Misha Serkinov, who is perhaps a little reluctantly back in the UFC. I'm calling this one pressure fighter versus boxer puncher. I think that's a pretty easy call as well.
Yeah, I think Özdemir would also like to boxer punch. I think he embodies the kind of tension in the Dutch style between wanting to be a boxer puncher and wanting to be a pressure fighter.
Yeah.
Or in that particular style of kind of Dutch style kickboxing, that because he's a Henry Hooft trained guy.
Right.
Like Özdemir is a pure Hooft guy in terms of his approach, it seems to me.
For the time being, though, maybe because of a lack of athleticism, I don't think he's really technical enough to consistently boxer punch. So I think he is probably going to, in the UFC, until he makes those improvements, or if he ever does, go in for pressure fighting more often than not.
Yeah, I agree with that. So the question here then is, can Cirkunov stick and move? I don't think Cirkunov is especially adept at sticking and moving, but is Özdemir's pressure going to bring him into the clinch, which is where Cirkunov really wants to be?
Yeah.
And I think it will, and in that circumstance, I think this is Cirkunov's fight to lose.
Yeah, and I think Cirkunov could actually win either way. Özdemir is quite hittable at range, kind of slow, both on his feet and with his hands. Little easy to predict. Cirkunov may not be a defined outfighter, but he did show some really nice outfighting skills, the boxer half of his boxer-puncher makeup, in his fight with Ion Cutelaba. I thought he did a really good job of keeping Cutelaba on the end of his jab. I think he is getting better and more fluid with his boxing, which is good because that was a problem for him for a while.
That's true. I need to reevaluate him a little bit because I had kind of pegged him as a guy who was slow of foot. And he is, but I think I don't think he's especially fast, but I think it's more that he's deliberate. Like, there isn't a lot of wasted economy there, and there isn't a lot of wasted motion.
Yeah, he's got some hand speed, too. I mean, he's got a quick jab. I would definitely recommend to anyone listening as well, rewatch that fight with Ion Cutelaba. You will feel encouraged to get behind Misha Cirkunov as a potential contender. Before we move on, does Volkan Özdemir not look like Rory McDonald after like 50 years of hard partying?
Yeah, he kind of does.
Right? Or maybe like Rory McDonald crossed with Fabio Maldonado.
That does not speak well of Mr. Özdemir, the Iron Hillbilly, plus Rory McDonald.
The Iron Hillbilly. Let's move on then. Johnny Eduardo versus Matt Lopez. Bantamweights here. I'm calling Johnny Eduardo a boxer puncher. You could maybe quibble with that and call him a counter puncher. He does like to counter punch. And Matt Lopez, I'm calling a pretty easily defined pressure fighter, at least for the time being.
This is a really interesting fight. I had kind of forgotten that this was happening, but now that I remember, I like this.
Yeah.
God, in terms of the stylistic matchup here, I don't know if this is about the stylistic matchup so much as it's about age and potential, because Lopez is young and making improvements from fight to fight. He looks really good. Eduardo is starting to finally look a little bit old after 21 years as a professional fighter.
Crazy.
So, yeah, I mean, he had his first fight when I was in 5th grade, man, or 6th grade. 6th grade, I think. Like, that's insane. That's totally nuts.
Yeah, it is. Johnny Eduardo, some of it, by the way, helped by the fact that he's been quite inactive. But still.
Yeah, he did have a couple of stretches where he wasn't fighting.
Yeah, still. But he has been in the gym training people. I'm sure he's been getting hit all that time. Still looks okay. What is it that suggests to you that he is slowing down, may I ask?
Difficulty pulling the trigger, I think. That was really apparent in his fight with Aljamain Sterling. That was a real problem. He just could not find the range. He could not find the timing. And Sterling is tricky and difficult in that regard. Like, I get that. And he did look pretty good against Manny Gamburian, but I think Gamburian has been a shot fighter for a little while.
Also quite shop-worn at this point.
Yeah, so it's really hard for me to take that as kind of that regard. Like, the difficulty in staying healthy, the difficulty in getting fights, like, I don't know. Jesus. I think I'm taking Lopez.
I think I'm going to take Eduardo. It's obviously iffy because of age more than style, but I think if he shows up looking good, that it's sort of like the slugger versus swarmer trope, right? I think the power is going to be enough to hurt Lopez, who isn't a particularly, great striker. He's aggressive, but Eduardo, good counterpuncher. And
Great
also,
footwork.
yeah, great footwork. Got that Novu Uniao takedown defense. Not quite on the Brow or Aldo level, but who is? Pretty difficult to get down. And not lost on the ground if he does get taken there, so I'd be surprised if he was like insta-tapped by Matt Lopez. So, and if Lopez gasses or wears himself out, then now of course that does rely on Johnny Eduardo throwing punches. But if Johnny Eduardo keeps moving and throws punches, I think he can beat Matt Lopez. Neither result would surprise me, but I'm just going to go for the upset there.
Yeah, I'm going to take Lopez though with some serious caveats.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's fair. It's an interesting fight. It's a good matchup. Next up, we've got a repeat person on our list here, Chris Weidman, who last fought Yoel Romero in our last round of picks, now fighting Gegard Mousasi, and we are continuing to call Chris Weidman a pressure fighter and Gegard Mousasi a boxer-puncher. We considered calling him a pressure fighter, but I'm not yet convinced that just because he's swarmed his last few opponents that that's the only way he can fight. I'm sure Gegard still has his spectacular jab that he used to utterly shut down Talaslitis and so on and so forth. So I'm going to call him a boxer-puncher, just sort of a technical but willing to be aggressive fighter.
Yeah, that sounds about right to me. And to me, that's why I'm taking Mousasi in this fight, is because of that versatility. I think that he can stick and move when Weidman tries to get after him. But more importantly, I think Weidman showed off a classic pressure fighter vulnerability, which is that he doesn't like to be pressured back. Mm-hmm. I think we've seen that from him in a few fights, that like he doesn't really have a lot to offer off of his back foot. His footwork moving backwards is not especially good. He relies heavily when he comes forward on kind of surprising explosiveness, but he's not an especially quick-footed guy by nature.
Yeah, he's not really especially quick in any regard. He's
surprisingly fast when he explodes into something, but like he's not fast on his feet like somebody like Luke Rockhold.
Right. And I would almost say it's only surprisingly fast because the rest of his movements are so slow because he's quite ponderous with everything else. Like I wouldn't say he's as explosive as Mousasi. You know, that kind of quickness and speed in his hands or in his forward movements. I think Mousasi, when he wants to, can explode very quickly. Mm-hmm. So I'm also going to go with Mousasi. I'm not as confident as you are, but I'm going to take the boxer puncher over the pressure fighter. I think, just like in the last matchup, I think the ability to counterpunch is always a difficult thing for pressure fighters, and then a boxer puncher has the flexibility to move laterally, to sort of do the traditional thing and counter the pressure fighter, counter his aggression with lateral movement, but also the willingness to either stand his ground or come forward. And you did convince me before the show. I wouldn't be surprised if at some point in this fight, Mousasi did try to pressure. Excuse me, did try to pressure Chris Weidman back into the fence and beat him up. Because, yeah, backing up in straight lines, just covering up. Weidman has been backed up by Lyoto Machida, by Yoel Romero, and by Vitor Belfort, and by Luke Rockhold, and he's never looked good doing it. So if Mousasi gets that idea in his head, I think he can run with it. 2 more to go here. We'll try to get through these quickly. We've got a great fight here. Kamaru Usman versus one of my boys, Sean Strickland. We're calling that boxer-puncher, a little tentatively, versus outfighter very confidently. What do you say about that one?
Yeah, so this is an interesting matchup, and it's basically going to crown who is the welterweight that we're keeping an eye on moving forward. I think whoever wins this fight is going to be the guy that the UFC pushes, kind of fast tracks after this, I think, into a top 5 matchup. So there's some real meaning to this fight in addition to everything else. As a pure stylistic matchup, I favor Usman simply because of that versatility again. Like I think he can fight on the outside. I think he can counter with Strickland when they're moving in that phase. But this is going to be all about Usman marching Strickland down, slamming him into the fence, and then working takedowns and just kind of riding him.
Yeah, and maybe this is in fact a subtype of outfighters that we've now discovered. But perhaps Sean Strickland's young veteran nature is an outfighting sort of tick. That he maybe has a different concept of what it means to be winning exchanges than other fighters. We've talked about this a few times on the show in the past. It's always a fascinating topic, but Sean Strickland's one of those guys who at like 15 was fighting grown men professionally and has had a surprising number of fights for a man his age, a young man, younger than me, and at times lets long stretches of the fight go by, almost seeming that he feels he's winning because he's not taking damage. You know what I mean? Like in the fight with Tom Breeze landed some shots, a few that looked really good even though they were a little glancing, he could catch the forehead and Strickland's head would fly back. Strickland, after the fight, told his corner he wasn't hitting me. So basically because Sean didn't feel hurt by any of the strikes or felt that some of them were sliding off rather than connecting as cleanly as they possibly could, felt that he had won the fight. And most did feel that Tom Breeze deserved the nod. Though I don't think it was an outright robbery. Most agreed, including both of us, that Breeze deserved the nod. So if that weren't the case with Sean Strickland, if he was a more consistent outfighter with more output, then I might be more confident in him in this fight. And he does have some surprising power. He's got a great jab. He's got good movement. And he is constantly improving and adapting his game. So he could surprise. He could very well surprise, especially because Usman does not have an amazing chin. So that we could get a shock here. But the fact that he is not just an outfighter, but a young veteran prone to all the mistakes of that breed, I'm going to have to take the boxer-puncher Usman over the outfighter Strickland. And finally, we have Ronaldo Jacare Souza versus Robert Whittaker. We're calling that pressure fighter, although a very low output one in Jacare versus a boxer-puncher in Robert Whittaker. I am going to go... Boy, that is a tough matchup. Why did I just volunteer myself to go first? Boy, what size is the cage going to be?
Yeah. Well, it's a big cage because it's a Fox card. But
I think I'm going to go with Whittaker, actually.
Yeah, so am I.
Yeah.
The big thing here, to me, is the counterpunching ability.
Yeah.
That Jacare is a pretty defensively responsible pressure fighter.
Mm-hmm.
You talked a little bit about his output, which is not high, but he is extremely methodical and very careful, and keeps a close eye on how much energy he has, knows when he can afford to explode and when he can't, knows how to cut off the cage with a limited number of strikes at his disposal and footwork.
Yeah.
He's really good at that.
Hits the body, uses that to corral his opponents as well. He's good at that. But more low output than ever before. Jacare is what, 38, 39?
I think 38 or 39.
Yeah.
And that's going to be the big difference here. I think when he comes in, Whittaker is not just going to try to get away. Whittaker is going to punish him for trying it, and Whittaker is going to hit him 3 or 4 times for every time Jacare hits him. So there's a huge difference in output. Whittaker's footwork is really pretty dang excellent.
Yeah.
And his takedown defense is just extraordinary. So if this turns into a striking matchup that revolves around Jacare trying to pin Whittaker against the fence, then I think he's either going to get outworked or he's going to get knocked out. And frankly, actually, I think he's going to knock him out.
You think he's going to knock out Jacare?
I do, yeah.
Very interesting. Okay, so a quick recap before we end this segment. And I'm really looking forward to seeing all these play out. I'm looking forward to this data pool slowly coming together because I'm really interested to see if we can actually get some convincing majorities for any of these classes of matchup. We took Will Brooks over Charles Oliveira, outfighter over pressure fighter. We both took Alexander Volkov over Roy Nelson. Although more tentatively than maybe we expected to, we called that outfighter over brawler. We both took Tim Elliott over Louis Smolka, pressure fighter versus boxer puncher. Pat took James Vick while I took Marco Polo Reyes. We called that James Vick the outfighter versus Polo Reyes the boxer puncher. I believe we both took Misha Serkinov over Volkan Uzdemir, calling Uzdemir the pressure fighter versus the boxer puncher in Serkinov. I took Johnny Eduardo, the boxer puncher, whereas Pat took Matt Lopez, the pressure fighter. We both took Gegard Mousasi over Chris Weidman, boxer puncher, beating the pressure fighter in that matchup. And then we both took Kamaru Usman over Sean Strickland in a great prospects fight. That's the boxer puncher versus the outfighter. And we both took Robert Whittaker and what will probably be a bit of an upset over Jacare Souza, the boxer puncher, beating the pressure fighter there if all goes according to plan. So stay tuned to the show in the coming months. I think our latest fight on that list is Eduardo Lopez maybe is on the last card, but I think it's in May. So we can catch up on this shortly after the beginning of May, basically, if we have a little gap in the schedule there. And we will see how these matchups turn out, and if we can gain any new insight. Maybe we will double down on some of the results we already had. Maybe we will split them and therefore require lots more data to learn anything useful from it. But that is Styles Make Fights. When we come back, we're going to talk about some boxing. We are going to run through 2 fights that happened last weekend. Roman Chocolatito Gonzalez fought Oh man, I'm going to mispronounce his name. Rungvisai. What's Rungvisai's first name? Srisi something.
Oh. It's something real Thai.
Oh god, hold on. I'm going to look it up real quick. Srisaket Sorungvisai, a.k.a. Wisak Silwangek if you use BoxRec, because they don't use Thai gym names, which is very confusing. Rungvisai beat Chocolatito Gonzalez, my number one pound-for-pound fighter in the world, and I guess I have to change that now, in a close fight, but not a robbery whatsoever. And Gennady Golovkin had a very close fight that many felt he should have lost to Daniel Jacobs. So we'll be talking about both of those, the two burgeoning stars, basically, of HBO boxing in this modern era, both having trouble. We'll recap that, break it all down in this next segment. Hey everybody, thanks for listening to this week's Heavy Hands. If you like what you hear, please consider pledging to support the podcast on Patreon. Patreon is basically continuous crowdfunding. You sign up to contribute a certain amount per month to help us with production costs and the like, and in return you get rewards ranging from a mention on the Heavy Hands website to a question or topic of your choice being discussed on the show. We have a lot more in the works to reward you for your help, and we appreciate every contribution. No amount is too small. Just head over to patreon.com and find how you can help out, the only show dedicated to the finer points of face punching. Now let's get back to it. And we are back after a very long but very fruitful first segment. Both of us have rested ourselves. We've recovered as best we can. And let's get down to business. Talk about some boxing. And defeating the Huns, of course. Let's go ahead and talk about Roman Gonzalez versus Srisaket Sorungvisai of Thailand. Interesting fight. Very tough on Roman Gonzalez. The first thing I want to say is, because I didn't watch this fight live, so I don't know what the reaction was anybody else confused by that event in the first round being called a knockdown? Was that a thing as this fight was playing out, and were you confused by it?
I was a little confused by it, but then I guess in hindsight, at the time it looked like a trip, but there was no trip. He just got knocked off of his feet by a body shot.
Yeah, and I've never seen that kind of thing called a knockdown. I mean, you are going down from a punch, but he certainly wasn't dazed or I think even hurt.
Yeah, it was very strange. I'm okay. I mean, I'm okay with it. I don't know. I honestly don't know how else you would handle that, because it wasn't a trip, right? He didn't trip over his feet. Like, he was planted on the ground by the force of a blow. I guess, isn't that kind of the definition of a knockdown?
I guess. Yeah. I mean, you go down from the effects of a punch. Yeah, I mean, I guess so. Yeah, but it was weird. Gonzalez was kind of up on his toes after throwing one of those, non-weight transfer left hooks, kind of just twisting up on his left hip, which is always an off-balance position if you happen to get caught there. And he got hit in the ribs on the spleen side of his body with a right hook, and he was off balance and he fell over. Weird event. I don't think I can recall having seen something like that happen and be called a knockdown. So I was a little confused by it, but it went in the record books as a knockdown. And Chocolatito, after that first round, I mean, he definitely lost the first round anyway, really had to kind of fight his way back into the fight, had to put on a bit of a gritty performance. And it was a tough one for him, mostly I think because Rungvisai was powerful and large. I'm going to say, not to insult the man, but Rungvisai is a little more of a crude fighter than, to borrow some boxing parlance, than Roman Gonzalez. Do you think that's a fair statement?
That he's a cruder fighter? Yeah, I think that's a fair statement.
Like a substantially cruder fighter, since we're comparing him to, arguably one the best boxer in the world.
Yeah, I mean, what was really striking to me was there were a couple of things that really stood out about what Sor Rungvisai did here. The first was that he very rarely let Roman Gonzalez build momentum, right? Like Sor Rungvisai was happy to exchange with him, and he made a point of being the one to finish exchanges, because really Roman Gonzalez fights like a snowball rolling downhill. That's what makes him such a great fighter. It's not that he is going to land 8 or 10 or 12 punches in a flurry. It's that he lands the last 4 in a flurry and then starts the next one almost right away. And so he gathers momentum over the course of a round. It's not like it's a kind of a misnomer to say that Roman Gonzalez like gets better as the fight goes on. He gets better as every round goes on. He almost gives away about the first minute of about every round he fights, and then around the 130 mark in every round, he starts to pick things up as he wears on you, as his pressure gets going, as you start to feel the effects of his body work. And so by the last 30 seconds or so, he is clearly winning things.
He's
and
just
so
tagging you cleanly, like sneaking all of these beautiful short punches right in the middle of your combinations, rolling away. I will say,
and so Rungvisai just didn't let him do that.
Right? Yeah.
He didn't let him build that momentum.
Yeah, he was like brutish in a good way. He kind of just hung in there and constantly threw. He had some good accuracy with his shots. Good hard left hand, obviously. He reminded me of like a Johnny Hendricks type. Not to cross the aisle into MMA, but I don't know. There's something about this type of southpaw that he just kind of reminded me of. I don't know. There was something strange about it. It was kind of like seeing Johnny Hendricks beat GSP, like not by being necessarily more technical, but by hanging really tough in there, and by being very physical, and by fighting intelligently. Johnny Hendricks would have had a similar win probably if he had continued that intelligent fighting into the 5th round rather than taking it 70%, although I don't know, I actually believe that's what he did. But Rungvisai, yeah, I think that's a very good point. He hung in there in the exchanges. I want to say, though, despite the fact that Roman Gonzalez lost this fight, and I do think there is a case to be made for him winning it, I don't think that's out of the question, though I can't really complain about it too much because it was very close. Maybe some of the best infighting of his career as he adapted to what Rungvisai was showing him and kind of figured out that Rungvisai was going to keep marching him down, so he should just stand his ground. His head position was on point basically all night after the 2nd round or so. Maybe the 2nd or 3rd round, he had figured out that he needed to keep good head position, and he was using it to turn Rungvisai off, because Rungvisai's big weakness in this fight was that he was very linear. Every attack was very sort of straight on, and he would kind of overextend, and that would give Gonzalez a chance to slip out the side, or he could apply a little head pressure or a little push with the elbow and direct that force by, and then land some punches. Now, Rungvisai hung in there and just kept throwing, even without throwing full power on his shots, just kept touching Gonzalez every time he did let these shots go. But when Gonzalez was managing to hit those really pretty pivots and getting that really nice head position, that was when he was landing his best shots of the fight.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to give Rungvisai a little dap for something he did in like the 11th and the 12th round, 10th, 11th, 12th round, where he turned into an outfighter for brief stretches of time, and he shut down Gonzalez's pressure. Gonzalez had gotten used to the idea of sort of Rungvisai kind of meeting him in the middle and banging it out, and then all of a sudden Gonzalez had to turn up his pressure. And he had to think real hard about cutting the ring off. And whenever he started to gather a little momentum, so Rungvisai moved into the inside and clinched him, and Gonzalez just could no longer get away at that point. Like, that to me was where the size difference really started to play into things, was when Sor Rungvisai was tired and he decided he needed to outbox. He couldn't let Gonzalez build any more momentum. He did a good job of that, and then stifling him on the inside.
Mm-hmm. I think maybe it's not size related, but boy did Rungvisai take punches very, very well. He did not show the effects of any of Roman Gonzalez's punches, and Roman Gonzalez knocks most of his opponents out, the vast majority of them. So that was impressive. I don't know if it's a size thing or if he's just a durable ass dude. But yeah, that's a very good point. Using his length, using his size from the outside in those later rounds, I thought that was a great adaptation, and it really threw Roman off, it seemed, because he had adapted his sort of strategy for each round. At that point in the fight, the last 6 or 7 rounds, he had spent basically being the counterpuncher, sort of playing the role of an outfighter on the inside, pulling backwards, cutting the angles, landing the shots in between Rungvisai's shots, and it really threw him off. And since we talked about styles in the last segment, before we move on, I would be interested to know what you would call Roman Gonzalez's style. Can you classify it? Is he our elusive all-terrain fighter? Because he does like to pressure fight a lot, but I don't think that's really his limitation. I think he really can do a lot of things to an excellent degree.
Yeah, I don't think that he's that great an outfighter. I think he can box a little bit, but not for really any extended period of time. He never seems comfortable to me doing that, and that is more than anything else, in my opinion, what sets apart the all-terrain fighter is not the fact that you can do it; it's that you feel comfortable doing it. I don't think that Gonzalez has ever looked comfortable to me boxing on the outside.
Yeah, that's a good point. But can you call him a boxer puncher then? Because he does like to counterpunch, and he also likes to pressure. But
yes, I think you can say that.
But he would be a very weird example of a boxer puncher if that was the case, right? Because he's a boxer. Typically, boxer punchers are guys who like have some outfighting ability, and that is the one thing that you're right he doesn't like to do. So it makes him a weird case. But that's why he's a fascinating fighter, probably the best in-fighter in the world, certainly in that discussion. And credit to Rungvisai for just, I think, sort of just out-tacticking, if that's a word. I know it's not, but tactically outthinking Roman Gonzalez, and then making a nice, just making nice little adjustments and constantly making it so that Roman, who is kind of a momentum fighter, could never get that snowball rolling. Gennady Golovkin fought Daniel Jacobs. Who did you think won this fight, Pat?
I thought Golovkin won it. And I thought he won it I thought the judges basically got it right. Go ahead.
I believe I loosely scored it 114-113 Golovkin, but I was not scoring that carefully. But I think that was one or two of the scorecards.
Yeah, I was paying attention as the fight went on, and I thought Letterman gave Jacobs a little too much credit. Like, I thought the second round was Golovkin's round on the basis of his jabs, which were just stunning. That's something we should probably talk about. And then I think the 10th, which I believe Letterman gave to Jacobs, I gave to Golovkin as well. The 11th was Jacobs' round for sure. I thought the judges basically got it right. Jacobs fought about as well as humanly possible against Golovkin. I thought, like, in terms of limiting the number of exchanges, in terms of actually producing offense, but doing so in safe ways.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, the story of the fight was Golovkin's jab. That was what won him the fight.
Yeah. It was a brilliant performance from Jacobs. We'll get back to that. What did you like so much about Golovkin's jab? I'm interested to hear what you thought of it.
Consistency and damage and cleverness. He mixed up the location. He mixed up the timing. He mixed up the rhythm. He hooked off the jab a little bit. He found ways to he manipulated Jacobs' hand positioning with it. I manipulated his head positioning. He used it to cover his forward movement. He used it in every way a pressure fighter, an aggressive fighter should use a jab while remaining defensively responsible. Did a great job too of parrying Jacobs' jab as he was throwing it, the way he let his right hand come out to catch the counter and use that to gauge the timing and the distance for his next shot afterward. I thought that was pretty brilliant. I thought this was, like, we have seen Golovkin's jab before. We saw it especially in the Lemieux fight. I thought this was the best jab he's ever shown, and it really showcased his all-around skill.
Yeah, it's a ramrod jab, man. He's got a shotgun jab, possibly the most damaging I've seen for his weight class since maybe Miguel Cotto or Ike Quartey, perhaps, whose jab was faster, but not quite as poppy as Gennady Golovkin's, not quite as thudding. I do wonder, what did you think of his approach in this fight? I was a little put off by the fact that he didn't really pursue the body at all. He threw very few body punches. In fact, I think Jacobs threw far more body punches than Golovkin did. Why do you imagine that was?
Well, so first of all, I think that got cemented as a narrative real early in the fight unfairly. I thought that Golovkin did work the body, maybe not as much as he normally did or not as much as he should have, but he did throw body punches. Like, he jabbed a lot to the body. He jabbed a lot to the solar plexus. He threw the right hand to the body. He threw right uppercuts to the body. He threw left hooks to the body. Again, the question is of degree, not whether he did it. Like, I thought that Kellerman seized on that really early in the fight.
Were the commentators talking about that?
Yeah, and I think, and I don't think he did it as much early. I think he did it a lot he threw a fair bit to the body in the middle rounds. But you're right. I mean,
less than we're used to, right? Like, Golovkin kind of came up and made his name as a vicious body puncher, and we haven't seen much of it in his last two fights, really.
Yeah, I think he would be well served to go back to it, but for whatever reason in this fight, And Abel Sanchez in the corner was telling him to throw to the body.
Yeah,
more.
I remember that.
Yeah, I mean, he was telling him he needed to do it, but I don't know why he didn't. Maybe he didn't think the range was right. Maybe he thought the head was there. Maybe Jacobs was doing a good job of baiting him. Strange. He should have done more of it, but it's not like he didn't.
He didn't
go there.
He didn't abandon it entirely. He just, I would have expected more. You know what I mean? Like, I would expect more from Golovkin in particular, because it's something he's very good at. I do want to speak.
Also, it would have been his best path to winning an easier decision.
Right, exactly. He could have slowed Jacobs
did not need
down.
To be as close as it was. Probably.
Exactly. He'd scored a lot of easier shots, done some damage. Jacobs extremely durable. Could have been finished with a body shot, where he wasn't going to be finished with a shot to the head.
This was something that I think it was Roy Jones said this in the later rounds as Kellerman was remarking on the lack of body work. I think he got scared off by the counters because Jacobs did counter him when he went to the body early.
And maybe that's why, as in the Lemieux fight, he relied so much on his jab, his safest punch, and really used it to set up only shots to the head. Because, body shots may be a little easier to counter. You get your hands down low, expose yourself. That could be it. I do want to apologize, I guess, for stealing multiple talk points from the HBO team accidentally. I watched this bout with Russian commentary. I don't know how that happened, but
thief.
Apparently I just stole all their shit that they were talking about during the fight. So sorry, boys. It happens to the best of us. I want to talk about Jacobs a little bit, though. Pretty brilliant performance. I think we can agree on that. For a guy who's basically not a highly ranked fighter in the division, was expected to get completely... I mean, everyone is nowadays, but Jacobs was not expected to really give Golovkin much of a test. And he did a really nice job, I think, of sort of controlling Golovkin, maybe lulling him into a certain kind of fight. And he had enough swagger, too, that I think he showed... Like, everybody else Golovkin fights, if they try to show off that kind of attitude, you can tell it's false. It's hollow. And it wasn't hollow with Jacobs. I think he was feeling good throughout long portions of this fight. I think he felt those jabs. He landed good shots. I think he felt like Golovkin couldn't get him out of there. And so he basically just spent a lot of the fight, trying to obey his corner, who were constantly and wisely cautioning him to be cautious. But also, putting a little swagger out there, which I think it's a good idea to go into a fight with Golovkin, feeling good. Like, it's the worst thing you can do against a guy like Golovkin is to treat him like Mike Tyson and just say to yourself, nobody beats Mike Tyson. I'm going to get fucking killed. And then, you know what I mean? That you can't let the aura kill you before the fight begins. And Jacobs did not do that, at least as far as I could tell. He looked very confident without ever becoming too overconfident. There were little bursts where he was having a little too much fun, but I thought he controlled it very well, maintained discipline while, having a little bravado, which I like to see.
Yeah, I thought this was about as well as he could have been expected to do. I do not think that he won the fight. I want to make that as clear as possible. Like, I think that there is an argument to be made for Chocolatito against Sor Rungvisai. I don't see an argument for Jacobs. Basically because even in the rounds where he was moving and boxing well, like the second round to me is the real linchpin of this. Like, he got a lot of credit, I think, for kind of looking slick and moving and landing jabs, except in a number of those rounds, Golovkin was doing more. Like, he was landing more jabs and harder jabs.
Yeah, like, constantly chipping away with those hard jabs.
Yeah, but because Jacobs was doing a good job of sticking and moving, that he was kind of automatically, like, I think in Letterman's mind, like, this again, the second round is the clearest one to me, where, like, Golovkin did more. He landed more shots. He threw more shots. But because Jacobs was sticking and moving, somehow he got the credit for that. Like, that, we've talked about this before in boxing, how kind of the benefit of the doubt often goes to the outside fighter. It's
kind of the opposite of MMA.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But in this case, I think Golovkin maybe didn't get as much credit as he deserved for doing a really good job of tracking down and landing shots on a guy who didn't want to stand in front of him.
Yep. As boxing fans, we're always sticking up for the pressure fighters. As MMA fans, we're always sticking up for the counterpunchers because those are the guys that don't get the love in their respective sports.
Yeah, so maybe we're just contrarians.
Maybe we're just contrarians. I think I probably am to some significant degree. So there's something to that. The last thing I want to say, very, very briefly, but I did think this was important, is that part of the reason that Jacobs did have so much success And whether anyone out there thinks it was enough to warrant a win, he did have more success than just about anybody else does against Gennady Golovkin. Part of the reason I thought he had so much success was his willingness to close the gap with Golovkin. Whether it meant pressuring in short bursts or stepping in and clinching Golovkin as he came forward. His willingness to step in and smother rather than just running away, like Daniel Geale style. I thought that was really effective, and I think it will be more effective for the next, better fighter that Golovkin faces if he can do the same thing, because not to hammer on about the regression, which at least was partially disproved by Golovkin boxing intelligently against David Lemieux, and in this fight to a degree, although I think there's still an argument to be made that his technical toolkit is perhaps not as deep as it was when he was like a Soviet-trained fighter. But I think that Golovkin's inside game is worse than it was. I think it's markedly worse, actually. I don't know that Abel Sanchez is great at training in-fighters, or maybe it's just what Golovkin prefers. He wants to pressure and keep you on the end of these punches and throw hooks. But he used to be really, really slick on the inside. Used to have great head position, really nice angles and control, solid defense. He sort of just goes high guard and forehead to forehead now. And I thought that Jacobs was kind of able to take advantage of that, because when he stepped inside and smothered, Golovkin was not working free very often and attacking him. In fact, it was often Jacobs.
There's also a real substantial size aspect to that, though.
That's true. That's true.
Jacobs was a lot bigger and a lot stronger. Like, it was there was a real clear size disparity whenever you saw those guys tie up.
That's true.
So yes, craft does matter, and I agree with that. I don't think that Golovkin was doing as much as maybe he should have in those tie-ups, but you can't deny the way that size played in there. Yeah,
that is a very good point and very worthwhile. But great job from Jacobs. I mean, he outperformed, and that's the best thing that you can say about this fight, is that he did way better than anybody expected him to do, and made a little name for himself. Gennady Golovkin, I thought, still looked like he can be a smart, capable fighter. He's not losing that edge. Say what you will about his technique, but the dude is consistently sharp in his fights, with the only exception maybe being that Kell Brook fight where I believe he had some horrendous flu during the weigh-ins, and he just went like a left hook crazy swinging at Kell Brook's head. And it worked, because when you're a puncher, that kind of shit works. So Golovkin, when he's on, is a real pleasure to watch. I think the jab, the left hooks, the ring control, everything was really, really nice. And the fact that he had somebody in there who was testing him, who was making him work to stay ahead, made it a very pleasing fight for me. So a weekend of very nice boxing matches, and that is it for our boxing coverage. When we come back, we're going to very quickly answer one or two questions. We're already creeping towards being well over time, so we're going to answer one or two questions from our Patreon patrons, and then we will wrap things up after this break. Financial support is fantastic, but there are other, even easier ways to support Heavy Hands. Perhaps the best is by spreading the word. We know our fan base. You're all cool, popular people with serious social media presences. You're tastemakers and trendsetters. Okay, there are one or two of you that don't fit that description. You know who you are, but no matter what, you can always help us out by telling folks about the show. And you can also give us a positive rating and review on iTunes and Stitcher, things like that. We rely on word of mouth and positive feedback to grow and improve, so thank you very much for your time and your help. Now, back to the show. And we are back for the final and very brief segment of Heavy Hands, episode number 152. I actually think I got that right. Ashley Dawson asked us a question. I don't have the heavy bag sound effect ready. That's it. Ashley Dawson, congratulations. First of all, thank you for your $5 pledge. She's one of our new patrons, but also congratulations. I believe you're probably the first woman to ever listen to this show, because it's just like male nerdiness. Just like, you can almost smell it, right?
Our first, I know for a fact that we have had female listeners before, but she is the first one to reach out to us. So, yeah. So hello, Ashley.
I mean, my girlfriend doesn't listen. Does your wife listen?
No, but she would know. You know?
Okay.
Leaving aside that god awful little bit of banter we just had there. What's the question? It was a good question. I'm very excited about it.
It was a fantastic question, which is why we need more like brilliant, intelligent women asking us questions on this show, and we're very glad to have you, Ashley. She says, could, by the way, be a male Ashley, and we could have just horribly insulted him. He could go by Ash. Who knows? I'm going to assume you're a lady, Ashley. Question is, could you talk about how the stylistic structure of particular gyms impacts the success of particular fighters? For instance, fighters like the Diaz's and Leslie Smith have similarities in their fighting styles that are relatively distinctive from other camps. They do train together, for people who don't know. Jackson Wink is known for their stick and move fighters. During the Manoa Anderson event, I felt like Amir Khani and Nelson were employing some stylistic touches similar to Conor McGregor's, I presume because those stylistic similarities are taught at SBG. Have you ever encountered a fighter whose skill set, talents, and or body type didn't mesh well with the stylistics of their coaching staff? Conversely, are there fighters that might be overachieving because of how well they can apply a particular coach or gym's methods? It's a great question. Let's get to the first part of it, because it's kind of a multi-part thing. The stylistic structure of particular gyms, how does it affect the success of particular fighters? That's definitely a thing that we have touched on before. We do certainly believe that certain coaches are meant to work with certain fighters, and that certain relationships don't necessarily work that well. We have critiqued in the past, I think, fighters not necessarily flourishing under the stylistic leanings of Eric Del Fierro. We're both great admirers of Firas Zahabi, but not all fighters flourish under his style as well. In fact, Tom Breeze recently left TriStar because he felt he wasn't allowed to be as aggressive as he wanted to be under the strictures of Firas's style. Are there any others that you can think of that are either examples of meshing well or not meshing at all?
Yeah, so we were talking about this actually in the comments of an article of one of these shows on Bloody Elbow not that long ago, and brought up TriStar as an example because stylistic stuff, yes, all of that plays in. Particular techniques that are taught in one place more than others, particular strategic approaches, sure. But there's also the aspect of personality, and sometimes personalities just don't mesh.
Teaching style and how it's affected by the way the coach thinks of fighting.
Exactly, yeah. So, I mean, if we're talking about fighters who have succeeded probably more than they necessarily would elsewhere, I think Beneil Dariush with Rafael Cordeiro is a good example of that. That I think for whatever reason, the stylistic, like there's a nice stylistic meeting of the minds there where you get Dariush's cerebral approach plus the kind of wild all-out aggression of Cordeiro's, and you get a really productive mixture of those two. Same deal with Rafael Dos Anjos there.
Yeah, I would agree. I'm going to shout out Edson Barboza with Mark Henry.
That's a really good one.
I think Edson has some persistent problems you still get glimmers of, and I think those glimmers would be a lot brighter if Mark Henry was not disciplining him the way he is. And I think Edson also quite likes the sort of family feel of Mark Henry's team. So he's happy at that gym, it seems, and he's obviously growing even now from one fight to the next in noticeable ways. So I think that is a wonderful meeting of the minds. Let's also say there are, like, what gyms have particular styles that you can think of. Rafael Cordeiro tends to specialize in pressure fighters. Firas tends to specialize in, like, cerebral boxer punchers or outfighters.
Yeah, kind of I think Zahabi's goal more than just about anybody else is to produce the all-terrain fighter.
Yes. Perfectly well-rounded, cerebral, methodical, but still dangerous, still capable of finishing. I think he has a real sort of fetish for well-roundedness. Mark Henry, of course, high output outfighting is kind of his thing. Dwayne Ludwig.
I would say really fine boxer punchers.
Yeah, that's what I would say too.
Is what Ludwig produces.
Really sort of fluid, dangerous boxer punchers who are very comfortable in range. Rick Little,
but with a lot of variability within that archetype.
Yes, definitely. Yeah. Rick Little produces morons.
With Jackson Wink, I think it's really a bit of everything. I think it's hard to pin them down to a type. I think because they are very focused on playing to the strengths of every individual fighter.
Yeah, she does say here that they're known for stick and move fighters. There are quite a few of good stick and move fighters from Jackson Wink, but I think Greg Jackson's philosophy is always like finding your athleticism, like finding the thing you're innately good at and then trying to feed that. And I think especially now with Brandon Gibson there, I think he feels the same way about teaching striking, that he wants to not try to force a fighter in a certain direction, not to prune them, but to refine and improve on what they do well already, or what they're suited to.
Yeah, because I think if you look at like Lando Venata versus who Gibson has trained from the beginning of his career, like there are some blind spots there, but there's also a kind of a commitment to making Venata do the things that he really wants to do in a fight.
Yeah, you get the sense he's being himself in there. He's having fun. He's relaxed. Yeah. Definitely.
Yeah, and because there is kind of an underlying belief that you fight the best when you're being you, and you want to find the ways to make that as effective as humanly possible. Now, with that said, there are that's not their only approach, right? Like Alistair Overeem can't maybe fight the way that he wants to fight because of his physical limitations. Andrei Arlovsky maybe same deal at this point. So you've got to be creative about it and find other solutions.
Yeah, maybe sometimes fighting the way you want to fight. Maybe the idea is finding the way that you are naturally suited to be best at, not necessarily that you would most prefer. Alistair Overeem is fighting, I think, a little against type in what he does these days, but it works really well for him. So it makes a lot of sense. Any other examples you can think of? I guess Henry Hooft, identifiable style. He's now at Combat Club, Gilbert Burns' Combat Club. I think he just recently departed the Black Zillions.
He did, yeah. That was kind of a messy thing. Yeah. I think it was Chuck Mindenhall who just put together a really long article on the messy implosion of Glenn Robinson and the Black Zillions.
Don't really relish the fact that season of The Ultimate Fighter ever existed, because I don't want to be privy to that just bitter sphere of the world between those two dudes, and between ATT and Black Zillions, and now the Black Zillions team and Glenn. Everything's just horrible. But
yeah, it's a kind of a bizarre whole thing there.
But Henry has an identifiable style, typically pressure fighting, combination punching, stance switching kickboxers are things that he produces pretty well. And
I think Anthony Johnson is his guy.
Yeah, and then Volkan Oezdemir is what you get if Anthony Johnson has very little power and no athleticism. It's but you can see the same things there. You know what I mean? The same moves are present. They're just not executed as naturally.
Yeah, true. Who else? Do you think there's an ATT style?
That is a good question. That one is hard to say. I think ATT may be the most it's a very conglomerate kind of thing. It's a lot of different camps in a sense. They certainly seem to have consistently good takedown defense and scrambling out of their gym. People who go to ATT get really good at stopping takedowns. But I don't know. They're kind of a well-rounded gym to me as well. But maybe not as much in a focused way as Jackson Winklejohn, which is not necessarily a bad thing. They're more individually fighter-focused, I think, and have a much larger team, so that produces a different kind of effect. You have...
Well, so let's answer the other part of the question.
Okay,
do you think there are some spectacularly bad fits?
Yeah, that's the ones that I thought of that I always used to stick in my craw, and it kind of made it seem like I had a grudge against Eric Del Fierro, who I don't, and I think he's doing some really good things with some fighters that he has right now. I think Eric Perez is looking better than ever, and I think Jeremy Stevens is looking great. And I mentioned earlier Marco Polo Reyes, I think, is flourishing at Alliance MMA. So those are all good fits, I think. They at least the results seem to suggest that they are good fits. But for a while, particularly with guys like Phil Davis and also with Norman Park, two guys I thought would probably be better suited and might feel more comfortable, being a little more aggressive, closing the distance with people. Two guys who are very good in the clinch. Phil Davis in particular, an amazing wrestler. I mean, easily one of the best wrestlers in MMA. And his striking style that he's learned pretty much primarily from Del Fierro has never really enabled his wrestling game. So it's almost always kind of happened by accident. People try to wrestle him and he gets to wrestle. So I always thought that was kind of a bad fit, if I'm being honest.
Yeah, I'm with that. I think Overeem, when he was with the Black Zillions, was not a good fit, either personality-wise or stylistically at that point, considering where he was at physically and kind of his declining chin. Like, that was not a style that was well-suited to what Overeem needed at that point in his career. I think Randa Marcos, when she went to TriStar, was not a great fit.
Yeah, I think she's better now, actually. I mean, I would love to say that, I love TriStar. I respect what they do, but I think she looks more comfortable now that she's left. And
yeah, I think that was as much a personality fit as anything else.
Yeah.
Like, it's hard for me to see her fitting in with like the Joe Duffys and Rory McDonalds.
She seems a little headstrong.
Nordy and Talebs of the world.
A little headstrong, maybe a little fiery.
Yeah,
not just
for that matter. I think you might say that Alex Garcia at TriStar is maybe not a great fit.
Yeah, I don't want to impugn the poor man who's had his troubles in the UFC. Alex Garcia doesn't necessarily, I mean, if you're just judging his appearance, he doesn't seem like a very cerebral dude. It's not just because he sort of looks like a Geo dude. I don't know. I just don't think.
Nice reference.
You know what I mean, though? Like, the way he fights is not TriStar. And the instructions he gets are TriStar. Faraz teaches him the way he teaches pretty much all TriStar fighters. Faraz has almost a one-size-fits-all approach with little tweaks for each guy. But Garcia doesn't do it. He doesn't do the methodical, deliberate, long-range boxing. He's way too easy to lull into winging bombs. And, I think it kind of hurts his confidence to be there too. I don't think he's not flourished there. We can say that, and that may very well end up being the case with Tom Breeze as well. We unfortunately didn't get to see him the other weekend. He got withdrew from his fight, but that's another guy who, by his own admission, did not feel that he was a good fit at TriStar. Any other examples?
Yeah. God, in terms of just. The style really doesn't work.
Did Rashad Evans ever look good at the Black Zillions?
Thought he looked real good in the third round against Dan Kelly.
That's true. He was showing some of that Henry Hooft skill. That's a good point. Yeah, maybe it was just too little too late for him.
Yeah. Other than that, no, I mean, in terms of spectacularly bad meetings, I'm trying to think off the top of my head. Nothing really comes to mind.
Yeah, me neither. I mean, I think typically, I think it takes a lot for a personality clash to have such a huge impact that it really shows up in your fighting style. Like there are, I'm sure, a lot of guys who are just sort of more mediocre than they would be under ideal circumstances, but don't look bad at the gyms that they're at, and we can't really know if they would really do well at another camp.
Yeah, I mean, and you have to separate out we're talking here about coaches who are good. Right, who are demonstrably good coaches with long track records of success. I don't think anybody looked better after going to work with Edmond Terverdian. So there's no real point in discussing that.
Who's a good fit with Edmond Terverdian? I mean,
nobody. I just want to post the video of Edmond Terverdian hitting pads.
It's not that bad. It's not the worst pad hitting I've ever seen. It's better than Sean Hannity's. Let's be honest.
It's not a high bar, man.
It's a really low bar. If you've seen that video floating around, Sean Hannity putting Chuck Liddell's winging punches to shame. But I think that's about it. Are there any other aspects to this question that we didn't touch on? That's pretty much it. Did you also see, by the way, some of the things she saw? Did Amirkhani and Nelson look a little bit McGregor to you at UFC London?
Yeah, I thought the attempt to time counterpunches by Amirkhani was very SBG.
There were glimpses of that in his fight with Mike Wilkinson too, which was his first fight with SBG. I felt that way when I watched that fight.
Yeah, I thought so. The Nelson, not quite as much.
Yeah. So, but that's an interesting thing, though. Is Conor McGregor the defining personality at SBG more than John Kavanaugh, or more than Owen Roddy?
It's a good question, and I don't really know enough about the internal dynamics of that gym to say.
But it does seem like a lot of fighters, like Owen Roddy, I think mostly teaches boxing, but it seems like a lot of fighters come out of there with the long karate stance and stuff, the sort of little things that hint of a McGregor influence. And whether it's just mimicry or McGregor is influencing actively the members of that gym, it's hard to say. Speculation, but people do tend to look a little bit like Conor. I mean, even Cahal Pendred tried to look a little bit like Conor when he was still fighting. So
Oof.
It was the least successful mimicry I've ever seen. But he did it, man. He sure did it. Thank you, Ashley, for that question. That was a very good question. And I think this will be a topic that will come up again in the future. Maybe we can think of some more examples, and doubtless more examples will arise that we haven't had occasion to learn of yet. Fighters that switch camps and do really well or do really poorly, and always learning, always discovering what works best for them. It's got to be very difficult as a pro fighter to find that perfect fit when you can't. Sometimes you got to train with a guy for 3 months before you're like, does not really working out. So we will see. I'm sure there will be many more who fit in either of those categories. Thank you again for that question. Thank you to everybody else who's been pledging to Patreon. We've got a lot of pledges in the last few weeks. If you have not submitted a question and you're a new pledge, go ahead and send it to us. If you're at the $5 level, send us your question via message on Patreon. If you're at the $20 level, send us your topic suggestion. We will get to them in the coming weeks, although the schedule is picking back up again very soon. Cormier Johnson next week. We've got some really exciting fights to discuss. And what do you have coming out this week, Pat? And if you say...
I got a couple of things.
Okay. If you say...
So first...
Not that much.
No. This is a busy week for me. I have two pieces for Bleacher Report. I have one on kind of making the case that the UFC should invest in more kind of wild, weird matchups, things like Luke Rockhold versus Fabricio Verdum that came up last week. Then I will have another one on kind of the upsides and the downsides of stacking cards like they're doing for UFC 211 in Dallas. Because while that's awesome and it creates a great experience, it also helps to kind of hollow out what you can expect in months coming after that. Like there is almost always a demonstrable downturn in the quality of cards after you stack one real heavily. Mm-hmm. So that is especially if there are injuries of any kind.
Fortunately, 212 looks good, so we're not going to have another UFC 208, but who knows what UFC 213 will end up looking like.
Yeah, the problem isn't going to be like the biggest cards. It's going to be what do the fight nights around then look like. Because a fight like Rodriguez Edgar would have been a fantastic headliner for a Fox Sports 1 card or a co-main for a pay-per-view or something like that. And instead, it's probably going to be on the preliminary card for UFC 211. Mm-hmm. So there are upsides and downsides to this. Like you get one great night, but then it also kind of hollows out your product moving forward. So I'll be exploring that a little bit. I will have a new episode of Fall of Rome out on Thursday, looking at kind of a a structural and institutional look at the politics of the Roman Empire as they fell apart. So not just like events or personalities, but what kind of deeper underlying issues were there that kind of saw the structures creak and groan and then finally collapse under their own weight. So that's me. That's what I'm doing this week. What are you doing, Connor?
Well, I had a piece come out just today called Boxing for MMA, Fisticuffs for the Freestyle Fighter, Part 1, The Guard. I talked about the differences between what we might consider a boxing guard and an MMA guard. And of course, because anytime anybody talks about hand position and keeping your hands up, I have to rant. I go into great detail as to the efficacy of a high guard, what it's good for, what it's not good for, and why it's sort of falling out of fashion in MMA. And it's going to be the first part of a series. I'm going to be next touching on body position and stance, the difference in combination punching, difference in head movement, and then sort of some of the esoterica that is unique to MMA now that boxing's rules have changed so much, such as, dirty boxing, hitting and holding, things like that, things that might be considered boxing techniques, but which are now more or less endemic to MMA. So keep up with that series. Check out the first installment. I'm pretty pleased with how it turned out. And then something later this week, maybe something boxing related, maybe something else. I don't really know yet. I'm going to kind of wing it. But it may be something on the Roman Gonzalez fight because I did find it to be very interesting. It may be something else. I think that's it for me. So, as usual, less than Pat, but come on, published an article, so it's going good. Holding it together here, not feeling sad, not feeling inadequate. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in this week to this episode of Heavy Hands. We loved having you here, and thank you again. A big thank you to all of our patrons who supported us, and a big thank you to all of you who listened and put up with the fact that I do feel as if my brain has been shutting down at various points throughout this episode. It's only the calming, sonorous voice of Dr. Patrick Wyman that has kept me sane, and as soon as we hang up after this episode is done recording, I will go reeling into the ether and live the rest of my life in madness and darkness. So that'll be fun. Otherwise, if you want to get at us on social media, Twitter is the best way to do that. At Boxing Bush is my handle, BUSCH, and Pat is at Patrick_Wyman, WYMAN. And if you came here today for the finer points of face punching, I would venture to say that you came to the right place. This has been Heavy Hands.